Kathy Judy. I'm the ELA Assessment Coordinator for the State Department of Education. And with me is Michelle McAdams, who's the Director of the Assessment Development, the content work that we do. And she's going to kind of keep track of questions, and she's going to answer questions, as many as she can along the way. So if you have questions, just keep typing them in, and she'll respond to them. Anything that she can't respond to that's really specific to ELA content or she thinks needs sharing with the whole group, she'll stop us every once in a while, and we'll take a minute and look at the questions and come up with some answers for the whole group. But it's a lot through in an hour. This was actually very similar to what was presented in June at the summit, and it was 80 minutes, but that was interaction and discussion, and this way, unfortunately, it's just me talking at you. But I hope you get what you need, and I want to really get you to use that box and ask your questions, and then I can just keep moving. And also to think of this as an introduction, okay? And it might tell us what we need to do later. All right, so these are the goals. In general, we just want you to know what to expect from these new assessments. But one of the pieces we are going to really focus on today is this second bullet, which has to do with how do these changes really affect instruction. I want to remind you that our students, your students in English 1 and English 2, have been taking a test very similar to this for a few years. Your 9th graders, grade 6, grade 7, grade 8. Your 10th graders, grade 7, grade 8. So they're actually, they might even be a little farther ahead of you as far as the structure and the content and the types of items. So I want you to remember that you have, on the whole, a group of students who are really prepared for this work in some ways. Sorry, can we hold just a minute? We're getting a little feedback. Let me see if I can fix that.
All new participants' lines will now be unmuted. Participant lines muted.
Okay, great. So what I want to reiterate is this idea that we really want to talk about the big shifts that need to be happening in the classroom, in instruction. So we're going to focus on that. The slides are very specific, and they get into all the nuts and bolts of the new test, but if I don't spend a lot of time on that, it's because I really do want to focus on this initial look at instruction and the big shifts that you are already making, already have made, or need to make in order to prepare students for this work. Okay, so why LEAP 2025? The short answer is really just that first sentence, which has to do with a cohesive assessment system. Like I just mentioned, your students, when they were in 6th, 7th, and 8th, they've been taking the LEAP 2025. So this way, everything from grade 3 all the way through grade 10 for English is cohesive. Same, very similar design, item types, reporting, all of those pieces are similar. So we're excited about that, and I think you are too. I think a lot of our high school teachers and our high schools have been looking forward to that move, to that shift. Okay, I'm going to start real broad, and then we're going to work our way down to a little more of the detail along the way. So the first thing I really want you to think about is the approach. And what we're initially going to do is just talk about what does the LEAP 2025 approach for English, what is that about as far as the instructional approach and how the test reflects that instructional approach. So this list is very long. I'm not going to read it to you. It's in the assessment guide. It's in all of our LEAP 2020 ELA assessment guides. But you see the word I want you to focus on is integrated. It's an integrated approach to reading and writing and language. That's part of writing. And these other qualities, we've been doing all of this work. I mean, some of the things that we might not have focused on in the past is this task approach, which is the third bullet, and this idea of focusing on words that matter most and really essential ideas in a text. So one of the things I want to start with is what it looks like to end up. And so the first thing I want to focus on is an actual released item. This is actually in the assessment guide for grade 9. And also on the right, I want to talk about how does that support our instructional goals. If you have spent any time with any of our instructional ELA materials, especially the standards, there's a whole section that talks about our primary goals in ELA. And they're very simple, which I hope you like. Read and comprehend complex text, and you do that by understanding the language and the vocabulary in those texts, and also the main ideas, the topics, the themes, all the standards, right, are great, you know, all those standards, especially number 2 through 9. And then the second part is, now that students are experiencing that work, how do they express their understanding? And there's 2 ways: through discussion and also writing about that. So that's the coding. You see the coloring on this slide. So this is an actual Prose constructed response, which is the writing prompt that's at the end of a task. So you need to think about the difference in our writing prompts. Now we have a task. So it has text and it has questions about the text that build to this culminating writing task. So that's what this is, the Prose constructed response. When you see PCR, that's the writing prompt at the end of the task. So this one is about the Odyssey and 2 pieces, a poem and a piece from the Odyssey. And this is standard 9, RL 9. And remember, the 9, 10 standards are banded, so they're the same standards. The thing that makes them different are the texts, right, and what we ask of the students with the texts at 9th grade and then at 10th grade. So you can see here, this first part kind of gives them a consider idea and gets them to think about these themes. And then the rest is really about their writing about what they understand about these texts. Also, the green, we would see some green if you think about the rubric, which also accounts for students' use of conventions. So that would partly be that green. Then I want to show you something from the guidebook so you can kind of see how they support each other. So this is a very similar task. It's actually the same standard, which focuses on RL9, that transformation of classic text. And this is from a unit in the grade 10 guidebook, which is called the Metamorphosis. And same thing again, where it asks for transformation. Very similar. You see the writing in the second part, and then they do call out the language skills there that have to do with conventions. So I just want you to think about what that has to do with, that's where we want to end up, right, that culminating task. But what I also want you to think about is students can't do this day 1, right? We have to build the skills to get to this. So the next slide shows you a lesson that's from that Metamorphosis unit that is building some of these key skills that students will need to get to that written understanding of complicated, complex text. So in this case, you'll see that there's several pieces. They're putting students in pairs. Students are starting with just the first chunk of the book, the novel, the Metamorphosis. They're working with a partner, so they're really getting an opportunity to talk to each other, to work through the text. You're seeing they're annotating the text specifically for unfamiliar words and probably other things that are coming up as they're reading. Then the next, and then you'll see that you'll see if you look at the whole lesson, which I have just kind of pulled pieces of it, there's also, if they have time, they would do some work with those unfamiliar words. But then the next part, now we move to discussing some questions about that text. So you can kind of see how this is reflected in the test. You have some text, they read the text, they answer questions, annotations, a great skill, and then they have to write about it. And you see writing all along the way here. You see that second bullet says, and they put their answers in their reading logs. And then they keep moving out, right? Pairs, my individual answers, a whole group activity that then discusses one question and a little more close reading, real specific work. And then again, you notice they're going to put the answers in their reading log. So this one is a great example of all of those goals being built, and that's just one lesson. If you look at the units in the guidebooks or your own units in the curriculum that you're using, think about how they're building these skills. You know, a little bit of writing, not a full essay, right? Just a little bit, discussion. And I want to make a point about this red that has to do with discussion. I truly believe that if a student can't talk about their understanding of a text, they probably cannot write about it. So I would encourage you, and if you look through the guidebook, you'll see so many opportunities for discussion. Small group, paired, whole group, reflection, lots of opportunities for students to talk out their understanding. That will serve you, especially students who are struggling with writing. You know, the more you keep giving them writing when they don't know how to articulate their ideas even in speaking them, I really encourage that. Okay, so from here on out, we're really going to try to talk still about instruction, but also about this comparison between where we've been with the EOC, and mostly the examples will come from English 2, because that was our EOC test that is now becoming LEAP 2025. We didn't have an English 1, right? But all of these things apply to English 1. Same design, same standards, so please understand I'm talking about both when I mention English 2. So this is just a quick comparison. It's real high level. So if we had time, what I would ask you is this question, which is when you look at the basic content of the English EOC test and then the LEAP test, I want you to notice the difference. So you have a writing session, you have a reading passages, a research section, it's discrete, you have a separate language section. So you see very choppy, kind of discrete, isolated moments, reading, writing, grammar, very isolated. When you look at the other side, you're going to see that task approach. So one task is reading, thinking, writing, and even language skills. So that's the difference that you're really going to see there. The next slide is going to go that much one step deeper and show you the sessions. So the English 2 sessions, you literally just have the prompt, right, with a text, and students respond. But on the other side, on the LEAP, you're going to see that students will have 2 tasks with 2 culminating writing tasks, which is already, that should make you think, okay, let me think about the differences and how that might affect what I'm doing, what I need to think about expanding on, maybe refocusing those ideas. Then the reading, we still have reading passages. Certainly, you'll see them in that 3rd session. And then the language and the research in our EOC were discrete. They were just questions about research. Now you have a task where students get 3 texts about a topic. They're very interesting, different looks at that topic. They have to answer questions about those. They have to compare those. They'll have, some of the questions will be about 2 of the texts. And then at the end, they have to synthesize all that information. Where our research was different than that. It was just a handful of questions about researching. And then the language skills on the EOC, we had separate grammar, right, where they were applied. We'd have a little question, and then they would say, you know, which is the way to revise this sentence, or which is correct, things like that. The way that we will assess language skills on the LEAP 2025 is when students write, which is are those 2 opportunities in those tasks, they will be held accountable for their grammar mechanics and usage. So that will be a separate dimension, and you'll see that on the rubrics if you haven't already. The biggest difference probably is that item types, right? We only had a multiple choice and we had the writing prompt. Now we have all these kinds, and don't get overwhelmed. We're going to go through every one of these with an example. So evidence-based selected response, multiple select, technology enhanced, and then that prose constructed response is similar to the writing prompt, but it's part of a task, remember. It's not by itself. And then the points, you'll see lots more points. There's more writing. right? More opportunities to show what a student can do, especially with writing. I want you to think about the fact that our grades 3 through 8 students have been writing responses to 2 tasks for 3 years. So our 3rd graders are writing 2 full, well, you know, based on what they do, responses, where our 10th graders have only been doing that 1 prompt. So it's a great opportunity for us to really get to improve our students' writing skills and have opportunities to work on that. And then lastly, the rubrics are different. And there's a link to them, but they are in this presentation as well. All right, now we're going to go one step further, and this is where it really gets into the minutia that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, and I hope that doesn't frustrate you. But we don't have enough time to go through all these pieces, and this is all in the assessment guidance. So if you open that assessment guide for English 1 or English 2, you're going to see these tables. You're going to also see a whole narrative section that explains every one of these pieces. What is the research simulation task? What is the literary analysis task? And then what are these different item types? And then at the end of it, you're going to see samples as well. So I want to focus on those samples. But I do want you to see that you have 2 different designs. Because there are 3 kinds of tasks, we do not do 3 writing tasks. We only do 2 of 3. So one of the forms, the possibility is a literary analysis task and the research task. The other model is the research task and the narrative writing task. And then around them are other standalone passages. We do that because we feel like 2 tasks, that's a lot of writing and enough to give us a good sense of where our students are at the end of the year. So if you want to dig into the specifics of that, like I said, the assessment guide has a lot of information. Now I do want to make clear to you that all students in that grade will just get the 1 design. So say the fall is a literary analysis task design, and maybe the spring is the narrative writing task. But 2 students do not have different sets of tasks. I hope that's clear. Okay, so there's the narrative writing. Very similar. Sessions 3 stays the same, 2 passage sets. And I want to just qualify that a passage set, when I say passage set, that means 1 text with questions or 2, like a pair of texts that are related with a set of questions. So I don't mean 2 different sets of questions and passages. That's explained in the text and in this note below. Okay. So that is the design, and I know that's a lot to take in, but like I said, I really want to spend our time on the item types and kind of the understanding of what's behind these different tasks and what you have to do to help build the skills that a student needs to be successful with these kind of items and with this approach. All right. So now we're going to move to the discussion of the item types. And I want you to think about these things as I am talking about the different types. I really want you to think about the difference, and we're going to use that comparison again between the EOC and the LEAP 2025. And they're also, every once in a while, I'm going to drop in a guidebook. I have 1 guidebook example as well. I want you to remember that everything you're seeing here is a reflection of our instructional work. And if you don't use the guidebooks, I certainly suggest that you look at some of the materials that come with them. But if you are using them, they're going to give you everything you need. And they will support all of these things that you're seeing. And if you're especially interested in that, I'll do a little plug for the teacher-leader collaboration coming up. There will be a session called, I think it's called The Missing Link. And it talks about how the connections between the guidebooks and our summative assessments. So I encourage you to find that, and if you can't go, find the PowerPoint when it's posted. So I want you to think about the differences between where we were and think about what do I have to do as a teacher or someone who supports teachers to make those shifts that are reflected in the changes. Okay, so the first one is, first of all, I want to talk about two item types. We have a kind of a understanding that selected response is a big type, and then all of the types but the writing belong under that. And what we mean by selected response is the student selects something that's already there. A, B, C, D, they click on D, right? Or it's a technology enhanced item and they drag something in. They don't have to write and create a response. It's just selected. That's why we call it selected response. So all of these item types except for the prose constructed response, which is a writing where the students have to write and bring their own thoughts, are what we call selected response. So this first type of selected response is the evidence-based selected response, and you've probably heard of this. It's a two-part item for the most part. At high school, there are a handful, not very many, of these three-part items, and I'll go through that quickly because I know that's new, especially if you've been looking at the 8th grade materials or the things that have been happening for a few years with our 3 through 8 program. So 2 or 3 parts. The first part asks primary understanding. It's those standards 2 through 9. So we'll ask theme, character, structure. And then the second part says, what's the evidence for that? And the evidence can take many shapes. It could be direct quotes. A lot of it is direct quotes. Sometimes they'll say, in what paragraph do you see the support? Sometimes it's just paraphrased evidence where it might say what event supports that, and they just paraphrase some details from the text. The 3 parts, you would have A, which would be that basic understanding, B would be evidence, and then that C is more evidence, or sometimes it's an extension of the evidence. We do have a sample in the, is it grade 9 or grade 10? I think it's grade 10. If it's not, it's grade 9. But in the assessment guide, I'll make sure to check that. There is a 3-part item, so you can see it. All of the selected response items, including this EBSR, are worth 2 points. So you can get 0, 1, or 2, which means we offer partial credit. Full credit means you got both parts completely right. That's easy. Okay, partial credit, the way you can get partial credit is you have to get part A correct, the part with the understanding. If a student can't identify the theme, but they happen to hit on the right evidence, we don't think they understand the concept, which is theme. So they do not get credit for that part. So it's not 1 and 1. It's not treated as separate. They're related. So if I get the first part A as a student, then I have an opportunity for that second part. If I get A, I have my point again, and then if I don't get B, that's it. I just have the 1 point. If I don't get A, I get 0 points. Okay, here's an example. This is from the research simulation task, which is the one that has this, which is about a given topic, and they have 3 texts. In this case, it's a court case that they follow from, it's during the Vietnam era about the protests, but you'll see it. It's actually in the practice test. So it says, which option best states a central idea? So there's that main understanding. There's that standard 2. And then the second part is the evidence. Which paragraph makes a point similar? So this is an interesting one. I've chose this for a reason, because I want you to see, because you have 3 texts, you will have some questions devoted to one text, more to the second, and then there will be questions that cross over the text. This is probably the most important thing for us to think about, is this real deep synthesis across texts. So if you are only doing one text at a time, make sure at some point you're introducing those other texts and the relationships between them. Okay, here is an EOC sample from our research section. Remember, discrete questions about research. So this just gives you kind of a scenario. Jerome is writing an essay about the history of the Panama Canal, and then he's looking at these sources, which is the least important to include. The biggest difference I want you to notice is the research item was about understanding the text and the topic. Our EOC research items were about understanding the process of researching. So they were about, like this one, which sources are most valuable. But they're really not asking students to understand the ideas in the research. So that's a huge distinction, if you could kind of remember that. Not that you won't continue to teach the research process, obviously, when you do research papers, but that's not what we're assessing. We're assessing that understanding of how those topics are working, how that topic is presented across 3 texts. All right, so that is the EBSR. You'll see that mostly. That's a lot of the items, those 2-parters. I also want to talk about, before I move on, let me talk quickly about how you can do this work in your classroom. I know the first thing teachers say to me is, oh my goodness, I have to redo all of my tests and put these 2-part items on every test and just give kids all this exposure to it. I want you to understand that you certainly want to expose kids to that, even though, of course, the practice test will do that. But I want you more to think about, how do I build the understanding it takes to answer an EBSR item? And I want you to think about how you do it every day, all the time in the English classroom. You have a question, you ask a student, what's the theme of this text? And I'm pretty certain after they give you an answer, you say, how do you know that? Where do you see that? Explain it to me. Where is it in the text? That's an EBSR. You just did that, okay? You do it every day, all the time. So think about that. Don't just think, oh, I have to put them on my test. Think, how am I developing the skills so a student can answer that? Really think about that, because that's the understanding. That's the thing that will make the difference for that student, not the form of the item. I want you to really think about that. Or same thing with multiple select. So they're sometimes 1 part, sometimes 2 parts. Usually they're part of an evidence-based selected response, that EBSR. And what they ask is they ask for more than 1 correct answer, which suggests that when you have a complicated text, a complex text, often there's more than 1 answer for things. There's complex characters. There's themes that might present themselves in more than 1 way. There's complicated structures. So this is a great opportunity for us to get at more than 1 thing about those major standards. So the good news is, in English, we always tell you how many correct answers. It's in boldface, and it says, you'll see it from the next example. Same thing, worth 2 points. When the multiple select is part of a 2-part item, same reasoning. So let's look at this next item. So here's an item. This is where the multiple select is in the second part, the evidence part, right? So the first part is just a regular question, but look at the answers, right? You see 2 things, right? Which describes the reaction of the farmers, and you'll see unsympathetic and somewhat amused. That's 2 things, right? So because you have 2, we need 2 opportunities in the second part to find things that match both those pieces of evidence. So that's why the multiple select, to me, is a wonderful opportunity to show complexity. And usually at high school, I'm pretty certain our texts are fairly complex, and we don't have flat characters. We have very complex ideas. And this is a way to measure them in a really thoughtful way that we didn't used to do, just because we didn't, it's kind of a new thing that we're doing in assessment, which I think is like what you do in the classroom every day. Now, how you would score this would be just the same way as the EBSR. If they do not get A, which is the basic understanding, the characters, it's the standards work, then it doesn't matter what happens in B. If they do get A, you have to get all of Part B. We do not do half points. So you can get 0, you don't get either part correct, or you don't get A correct. You get a 1 where you got A and not B, and you can get a 2 where you got both parts completely correct. Now, if this were flipped and we asked for 2 reactions, that's a different story. If the multiple select is in the first part where that first point lives, that content knowledge lives, if a student gets 1, so say there were, 6 answers here, or 1, 2, 3, yes, 6 answers, and it went through F on the top, and we asked for 2 things, and say one said unsympathetic and another one said somewhat amused. Those were the 2 keys. If a student only got 1 of those 2, they would get a point because they're showing partial understanding of that. But then they're done. There's no more points because they already have only a partial understanding. Again, there's lots of explanation about this in the assessment guidance and also in the practice test guidance. And when you get the practice test answer key, it has a whole section where it talks about how you score all these different types of items. And then if you still can't figure it out after looking at all of that, send us a note through Assessment Mat. All right, so here's a multiple choice item, very similar. Good alignment, right? How does this character react in his interaction with the servant? Nothing wrong with this item. The only difference is we don't ask for evidence. So we don't, it's just another way to say, I get it, and I get it fully. I know where it is in the text, which is really our measure always of our students' understanding. Now, as far as multiple select, I want you to think about, again, do you have to make all your tests have multiple select? No. You do this every day when you ask one student, what do you know about that character? And they give you one trait, but that's a complex character, so you say, what else? And another student gives you another character trait. That's a multiple select. And then you say, how do you know that? This is how I know it. This paragraph here, this character did this. He said this. There's the evidence. So that's what I want you to think about, how you're already doing it and supporting it and building those skills. All right, so the third kind of selected response, which is the newest for us, is this technology-enhanced item. And this uses technology to get an understandings we couldn't assess in the past. And I always use the example of the summary. In a multiple choice item, you can't order details, right? You can just, a student can just pick the right thing that's the summary. But here with the drag and drop, we can give students several details and we can have them first choose the 4 details that are most essential to a summary and then actually order them. And that's the beauty of the technology-enhanced item. It allows a much more complex, it gets at meanings that we couldn't get at. Again, I always say the beauty of the LEAP 2025 is it reflects what you do all the time. It really does reflect instruction in a deep way that we didn't always do just with a multiple choice question. We have a few kinds, drag and drop. A drop-down menu is, it's usually a paragraph or a few sentences, and then it's like a fill in the blank, right? Students, like they might say, the purpose of this article is to, and that would have a drop down with several answers, and the student would just click on one, and then it will continue maybe with 2 or 3 drop downs. It's rare, it's usually you have more than one to show a concept or an idea. And then there's text highlighting where maybe the first part is part of an, technology enhanced can be part of a 2-part item. The first part could ask you for that theme, and the second part they might pull out a paragraph and students highlight some evidence. So they just click on it. And all of the technology-enhanced items we have kind of summarized in a document that's called the LEAP 2025 Technology-Enhanced Item Types. And it gives you a chart about where you can find these different types. It explains the different types. And then it shows you, it tells you which online tools training would have those types. So even if, say, the English 1 and 2 doesn't have every possible kind, you could go to the U.S. history, or you could go to any of the other ones that say these other types. This is worth 2 points as well. It's much more complicated to talk about the scoring of it because depending on the type, it has different rules. But it's still worth 2 points, so you can get partial credit. So for example, in that summary, one of the ways a student can get partial credit is if there are 6 answer options, and we ask students to fill in 4 summary details. If they choose the right 4, but they're out of order, that student gets partial credit. They get a point. So that's, that's exciting, because I think that suggests they understand a summary, major details, but they didn't get it in the right order. So that's what I love about the 0, 1, 2. You get to see that student who's on their way, but they're not fully there. Where in the past it was all right or all wrong. You couldn't always see shades of understanding and meaning. So I encourage you to go to the online tools training. The sample I have on the next page is called a match interaction. And really, a student just clicks on one of the boxes in each line. This is from a standalone set that I believe is on the practice test. And it's 2 texts about Einstein. It's an informational passage pair. And you can see this would be at the end of the set when you've answered questions about each, and now they're asking a student to synthesize that understanding. So it says, which of these ideas where do they belong? Is it this text and that text, or both? It's really, if you think about the learning under this, it's a lot of really wonderful synthesis, but it's not, you have to build that, right? You have to build it with one text. Do I understand one text, a second text, and then those relationships? So again, if you're not offering students more than one text at some point, related text, then this would be very difficult for a student to do. So think about that. How am I doing that? When am I doing that? How often? Again, you're building it. If students can't respond to one text, probably not a good time to give them 2 until you've built some of that understanding. How is this in your classroom, right? Again, think about how you might do this. I think with high school you have a great opportunity to have students play with some of this. I would, as a teacher, if I were in the classroom, I would love to give them something like this and have them do it for 2 texts that they're working on, to do their own samples of these or some drag and drops. I think that would be a great opportunity for them to really understand the parts of it. Okay, so that's the selected response. The second type is the prose constructed response, which you saw earlier in that sample about the Odyssey. And that's the culminating writing task that is at the end of a task. So I want you to remember that it's not by itself. There are questions that come before it that help scaffold. And I always think of the questions as part of the brainstorming, the pre-writing, really offering students opportunities to have a lot of knowledge before they face that prompt. I also encourage you, because it's an online test, students can jump to the last item. They could look at, well, where am I headed here? And then along the way, they could do maybe much more focused annotating and really noticing. So we do expect a complete written response, an essay at this level. So people always ask me, do they expect an introduction and a conclusion? And I always say they expect a kind of introduction and a conclusion. It might not be as long as you might do when you have no time constraints, but they do expect that a student will get in, explain, get out. Okay? And there'll be lots of samples of this when you look at some of the student work, and you'll get a better sense of the expectations. Okay, so here's that sample from the question that was the evidence-based selected response, was from the same set. It was from this research set, and this is the culminating task. And you'll notice it looks a little different than our writing prompts that we're used to with the EOC. It gives the student a little more guidance. It says, here's what you've read. Think about, consider the points made by each, and then it's going to build to the task, which is to analyze the arguments. And you'll notice in this one, the essay that they have to write only has to use 2 of the texts. So sometimes, depending on how complex the texts are, it will say that. It will only say 2. It will always be at least 2, however, because this is about synthesizing text on a given topic. Okay? So that's the research task. This is a narrative. Somebody asked me this morning about did I have a sample of a narrative, and I hadn't put a sample in. This is from the assessment guidance. And this is, I believe, in the OTT too, you'll see it. So at the end of the passage, and this was the same thing, a task. It had questions about it that students answered, and then their writing. This one's a little different, and probably the thing that's most new to our high school teachers, which is narrative writing. We so think of that as being belonging to our younger students. But I want you to think about a student who can write a narrative really understands literary text. They understand plot, they understand character, they understand structure, they understand language. So really think about that, how you might find a way to move from literary analysis to narrative. So here's an example from a released item, which this is from Far From the Madding Crowd, very famous text. And this is a character, it's just a small cutting where you get to see Bathsheba and her interaction with Farmer Boldwood. And so you'll see the task in the end is based on what you know, so they do have to understand the text in order to do this. Write a third-person narrative that continues the story and tells what happens next. So there is some understanding about, they can't write about the man in the moon, right? It has to be related to the text. I put in this extension task from the grade 10 metamorphosis unit that I mentioned earlier because I want you to see that there are narrative tasks in the guidebook too. And here's a particular one, and it relates to the earlier question in the guidebook that was about magical realism. What I also want you to see is they're building to the narrative task, okay? First, they're reading a new text. It's new, so it's a cold read. So I encourage you, even if you're not using, although this one would be tricky because it talks about magical realism, but it has to get to the writing test, which is to write your own modernized version, so you're writing your own narrative. They're saying you need to read and analyze this text, you need to summarize, and they actually give you a nice chart that shows students, gives them a place to summarize and take notes, and then really gets your understanding of this concept of magical realism and what that looks like and what are the qualities of it, and then they write their own story that would have magical realism in it. So I want you to see that we're building, right? We're not just expecting that students can do this. So you have to build it. I always say, if you build it, they will come, right? There's my field of dreams. All right, here is the other kind. I want you to see the example from the English 2 test from the EOC. We did have literature, right? We had a piece of literature or an informational text, and students, look at the difference between it. They give you the excerpt, and you read it, and then students have to write an essay that explains how certain experiences can affect the way we view our lives and the world we live in. So really, the prompt gives them an idea, and they use the text to support their own idea about this theme. They are not analyzing that text. They have to understand it, but not in a deep way to be able, they're not telling you about Pip. They're saying what they think about this certain experiences, and they often bring in their own experiences, but they're not really doing literary analysis. So that's the difference. Here's the one that LAT is the literary analysis task. That's the other task. Here's an example from that. 2 texts for the literary analysis. And remember, there'll be questions that scaffold this. Write an essay in which you analyze the different approaches the authors take to develop the main characters. So this is full-on literary analysis, right? It's about these texts, and they have to understand the text. So that's what I want you to think about. Like, what's the difference here? One is just using that text to support my own ideas, and the other is showing a rich understanding of each of those texts. All right, now the rubrics to score these, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because you're really going to want to dig into these, and assessment guidance, again, talks you through the rubrics. It has links to them. But I do want you to know you have two rubrics, one for the literary analysis and the research test. They have the same rubric. And then the narrative writing test has its own rubric, it's very different, right? We're talking about description and dialogue. Those are not things that you would use in a literary analysis. So you'll want to spend some time really looking at those. There are two dimensions on the rubrics. The first one, the LAT and the RST, it's a combined reading comprehension / written expression and then conventions. The narrative prompt only has written expression because we don't hold them accountable for the text and the reading of the text, because really it's an extension of it. It's about their creative writing, their narrative skills. And again, the conventions are only scored here in the writing prompt. Now, this I really want to make a point of, and luckily someone asked me the question because I had forgotten to mention the bottom part of this slide. The number one question teachers want to know when they have a new rubric is what are the expectations? What does a 4 look like? What does a 3 look like? What does a 2 look like? And we don't always have lots and lots of student work. We will have student work for one of these tasks on the practice test, but we won't have student work for all of them. So if you do one thing, I hope this is what you do, is the scoring activity. Because what it does is it puts a bunch of grade level teachers together with a common prompt, and they talk about those student responses. They decide what's a 4, what's a 3, what's a 2, what's a 1. They use the rubric language. When you come out of that kind of activity, you know that rubric in a rich way. You see together. You talk about expectations. If you have lots of different teachers at the table, they get to see, maybe an honors teacher sees a struggling writer, vice versa. You really come out with a sense of the strengths and weaknesses across your department. So I really encourage you to do this. Right now it's in the back of the ELA practice test guidance, and this link will take you to that guidance. I think maybe there might be a link that's broken. We'll try to fix that when we update this document. But if you have any questions when you start to look at the scoring activity, please send us a note through Assessment Add, because I would really like for you, for teachers to try this, and for principals and districts to give your teachers time to come together and do this work. I also think the scoring activity is great to do with your students. High school students are, they're able to talk about their writing and discuss that rubric. So I encourage you to just use that activity, but with students. Yeah, I just got a question about, is there a list of concepts like magical realism that will be assessed? I want you to understand that that was a guidebook task, and they built that understanding of magical realism. Our test, students do not have to bring any prior knowledge to the party, okay, to the test. When they take that test, everything they need is in that reading passage, and they have to show their understanding of it. There will not be literary, devices, and there will not be this idea of literary periods like this magical realism or types of literature. That will not be the questions. The questions are about, do you understand this text, and can you write about this text? Okay? There was a question about, on the rubrics, what is the definition of style? And it says, is it based on syntax, diction, voice? It's probably less about, it's all of those things, but really it's about clarity in language and the choice of the language. So I really want you to think about that. It is about those other things, obviously, but I want you to think about clarity in every way. Language structure. So yes, syntax, yes. Language, yes. Okay? But it's a piece of a whole look. Remember, when you look at the rubric right now, you'll see that's holistic. So all these bullets, they don't each get their own points. It's one holistic. So when I'm looking at a student's work, I'm saying, where does it fall mostly, right? It might have a little bit of 3 and a little bit of 2, but on the whole, you might say, this is a 3 for the most part. And also, there is some discussion of that in the guidance, but this is holistic, so don't try to cut up and look for just style, just language, just organization. We are not doing that. That's what I'm talking about with this integrated approach, really thinking about that. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't use this in other ways. Please do. If you need to work on organization, it's certainly fitting. Maybe you just want to use part of this rubric as you're building that knowledge. Absolutely. That makes perfect sense. Right? When you figure out the strengths and weaknesses, you certainly want to do some targeted approaches. I just don't want you to think of writing as its own thing and it's not related to the reading and the understanding. There's the narrative rubric, and then this is how you figure out the points. Because you'll see it's 4, 3, 2, 1, you think, how do I get to 19 points, right? And this explains that, and it's in the guidance too. Okay, so that's a lot of information, I know. But what I mostly want you to be thinking about along that way is, how do I get my students to this place where they can answer these kinds of questions? And like I said, think about how you can build it into your daily work and how you're already doing it. And if you're not asking that second question about evidence, think about, how do I make that happen? That's what I want you to think about. That's why I showed you the EOC and how we're kind of moving from one thing to the next. And when we look back at that EOC, like I said, when you see those items, where did they go? Yeah, like this one, you see that it didn't ask for evidence. So I just want you to think about, what am I doing right? You know, really, what am I doing that's really supporting this understanding? What do I need to kind of expand? You know, really maybe refocus. All right, so that's really the design and the most important part as far as the instructional ramifications. Now we just want to look at a little bit of the design, the test itself in the administration. Just the nuts and bolts, what's different. So this page really, same system, that's the good news, right? Your students have already been on this system, they've used those tools. Now you do want to put them on the English 1, English 2 OTT, or right now, put them on the 6th through grades 8 OTT, just so they can practice these different item types, clicking on it, scrolling, part A, part B, multiple select, you know, using the passages. So I would suggest you use that online tools training with your students more than once, okay? And, you know, give them opportunities as much as you can to just feel super comfortable. So when they're in the test, it isn't about the tools. It's about what they know. So in the past, we've had scratch paper. We still have scratch paper, although there are online tools that act like scratch paper, note-taking, highlighting, all kinds of cool things. And then I do want you to notice we do have a spell checker, which we didn't used to have because they had dictionaries. But now we do allow that because if you notice on the rubric, it doesn't mention spelling for language. It mentions mechanics, grammar, and usage. Not to say that if a student can't spell at all, that would be a clarity issue, right? Which would really come into other play when you look at the rubrics. No more dictionaries and thesauruses because we're talking about a task that has questions, vocabulary questions, so we cannot leave them with a dictionary in their hands because now they could look up things instead of showing they understand the text. So also, it's about time too, right? Some of these things, when it was unlimited time, made a difference. And it was just a prompt. There was no reading that went with it. And then the model parenthetical citations, we don't need that because remember the shift in research tasks is away from the process. So they would not need a model parenthetical citations. What they need to be able to understand a topic and how it finds its way into 3 texts. The biggest difference for you, and I know this is a big deal, and I want you to think about it, and the practice test guidance has a lot of ways to think about how to work in some timed activities, is it's timed. So that's the thing I know is is a big difference. So think about how do you build that as well. How do I build comfort with the process so that students can do the process, but efficiently and under time circumstances. So that's about building again. That just gives you the timing. If you haven't looked at the assessment guides in a couple weeks, we have updated them and we've changed the timing just on the last section. We decided we didn't need as much to do. 100 minutes was starting to get, quite a bit. So we took out some questions and now it's just 80 minutes. And that includes the extra field test set, which I don't know that I mentioned earlier, but in session 3 there are 2 passages or passage sets, and then there's this third passage set that we're field testing so we can continue to develop our tests as we move forward with this program into the future. Again, all of this in the guidance with explanations as well. Reporting, last year we still did kind of the sections, writing and language, reading and research. The difference now is we're really doing big claims, reading, writing, and then subclaims under each of those claims. Reading literary, reading informational text, reading vocabulary is under reading, and then the writing has to do with the written expression and the language skills, which all of that comes from that prompt, right, when the students write. Those points are all from there. Achievement level differences, right, we're moving from 4 to 5, same as grades 3 through 8. There they are. They're in the guidance as well. They're in our assessment guide. And then here's our kind of schedule and I know that you'll notice this January 2018. If you haven't seen this yet, we are holding. We want to make sure we get everything right and that we check all of our work on this new test before we report. I can't give you any more information than that right now. If you have a very specific question about that, please send it to assessment@la.gov, and that address is on the very last slide. Resources, this is really just a list of different resources and links to them. So here are the guides, the assessment guides, and the rubrics. This is all on the assessment guidance page, so that first big link, that takes you to our assessment guidance for all of our content areas, and it has everything you need that goes with the test. So you'll see that. So these are direct links if you want to get to the rubrics and the guidance. That OTT is what I mentioned earlier, that online tools training. We had it last year for English, for EOC. This year it's just English 3 will have its own because it lives in the EOC world still, but English 1 and 2 will have their own, and we're working on that now. If you want to put students on that OTT sooner, put them on the 6 through 8. It's not about content, it's about the tools, right? And then this is the most exciting, is the practice tests, right? These are coming, they're on their way. The only difference I want to point out is the practice test will have 4 sessions, but the actual test only has 3. Because we do 2 of the 3 tasks on the actual test, we want to prepare students for all 3. So this has 4 sessions. So it has all 3 tasks and then the session with the standalones. And that just explains what it looks like. To access those, here will be this teacher access link, and all of these materials underneath will help you get set up, and the keys will be on this practice test page when they're ready. And then this guidance I've been talking about that has that scoring activity, here is the link to it. Right now it just talks about grades 3 through 8, but it's all applicable to English 1 and 2. So please go on and look at it. And then the educator scoring piece is about what you will do to score students' responses to those writing prompts in those tasks. This is the LEAP 360. I'm sure you've heard lots about it, but it's essentially what we're trying to do is to give you a more comprehensive look at a student and not put so much weight on our summative tests, to really talk about, to honor what you do all the time and to honor a whole look at a student. So it moves from diagnostic to interims, and then the EAGLE supports that along the way, and then getting us to our summative work. This These resources at the bottom will give you everything you need. It's a beautiful explanation of it. It's a very comprehensive guide. And then the Quick Start Guide is the nuts and bolts to get set up if you're not already. I know many of our schools are already using the diagnostic tests. These are instructional resources that I hope you'll use. If your district, your parish is not using the guidebooks, I do encourage you to still go to LearnZillion. There are some wonderful resources that are associated with the guidebooks. And so I hope you'll take advantage of that, take some time, and just do a little of exploring. And then the standards, if you've not looked at the standards document, it's not just the standards. There's wonderful work around it about complexity and how to make, how to talk to students about the standards, how to interpret the standards, progressions across the grade levels, really good. Lots of links. So I would open that. It's not just the standards. And then these are some other things that are on here. I especially encourage you to look at this instructional strategies. There's a whole list of very interesting different ways to talk to students and work with students. And I just mentioned a couple, like annotating text and student-led discussions, things that I think can really serve you in the classroom. And then the teacher library, that's just for 9 through 12, so it's kind of a place where you can see the high school ELA materials, and that includes the guidance and some of the assessment materials. And then the teacher leader library, I encourage you, if you have not been to the collaborations, but you'd like to find some of that material, this link will take you to the presentations, the most recent. And you can download, whole presentations and, kind of your own PD that you can do. Okay, I don't want to forget English 3, because we still have it. So you'll notice the difference is LEAP 2025 means the new, where we're headed, our future. EOC, we are going to make sure that our students in that cohort still have EOC English 3. So they will take English 2 this year, and then next year when they take English 3, it will be the EOC. This year, same thing. Our English 3 students, they're going to see English 3 with all the same things. It's not changing, right? Same design, same materials. You will have a checklist. They will have their dictionaries because it's the EOC, just like they've been taking all these years. Same reporting, 4 levels, passing requirement, all of that. So don't apply any of that to EOC. When you see EOC, that's a 4-level test and everything that comes with it. These resources, here they are. The only thing that doesn't have a link so far is that OTT, but it's coming. It looks just like the OTT from last year, except no English 2 items on it. It's just devoted to English 3 and the EOC. Okay. So I don't know if Michelle has lots and lots of questions.
Actually, it's been fairly quiet. We do have a request to go back to the NWT slide.
Okay. And now what do we mean? The sample of the NWT? Probably. Or the maybe.
I don't think it's the design.
It's not the design?
I think it's the same.
Okay. Just want to get a better look. I see there was a lot on there. So the top is the assessment example, and the thing underneath is a unit in the guidebook that would lead to a narrative task. What I do want you to know, and that question about magical realism, that is from the guidebook, and that would have been a whole discussion about that concept. But like I said, you will not have to, students do not have to bring information about literary periods, and that's not what we're assessing. We're genuinely assessing understanding, reading, comprehension, writing in response to text, evidence. Really, it's about can you read and write, and not to say that you can't certainly spend time on some of those other things, but think about that in your approach as well. If you're spending a lot of time talking about those literary periods and not really getting into the texts that are at the heart of them. Okay, we have a question. Other than devices that come up in standards, suspense, mystery, foreshadowing, student not, okay. Now do remember that when you look at they're asking about different literary devices. Now, depending on the grade level, you have to remember where they've been, right? So they've had standards at other grade levels about personification. So students need to have that knowledge. Usually you won't see it, just flat out what's the personification, right? It's how it's being used. So yes, do look at your standards. If you look at the language standard, especially L5, it sometimes calls out specific figurative language techniques, but it does say figurative language. So you should think about the kinds of things that a 9th and 10th grade student should know. But like I said, the items aren't really about that. They're about the use of it, although you may see some uses of things that we expect a student knows, like personification. It might mention metaphor, but sometimes it just says figurative language. But you have to think high school. If you'll notice, by the time you get to high school, you will have, go back and look at standard, that L5 at grades 8, 7, 6, 5. You'll see lots of other techniques. That's why I encourage you to go to that standards document, because it gives you a progression across the grade levels of a standard. So you could look at L5 and kind of see the expectations as students get to 9th and 10th grade. And again, when you look at the practice test, you'll really get a sense of the kinds of things and how those literary techniques are showing up. It's not really about do you know the technique. It's really about how a writer uses language to make meaning. I hope that makes sense. I don't have a list, so I just want you to go back and think about what do you expect based on the standards that have come before, the language standards, that L5. What should a student already have acquired? And a thing like personification, I think it's like grade 5. So, these are things that we would expect a student could use in an answer, in their answer. They would be able to understand when they say an author uses personification to do X. So I'm not sure if you're getting what you need from this narrative, but I do recommend that you think about it. Usually the narrative task is finish the story that started, tell the story in a different way, right? Like maybe it was written in first person, they might ask you to write it in third person. And again, those are older skills that a student would have known the difference between first and third. And then it might ask you to take a different character's point of view, like maybe, let's see it from the other character and how he might tell that story. So there's not a lot, there's not a lot of variation. I think if you can get students to understand that, and you'll get to see some samples, certainly in the practice test, and in the assessment guide has the narrative that I showed you. Okay, we're just looking at some more questions. We don't have any more questions. I know it's late, 4:35, 4:30, 4:40. So I appreciate your hanging in there. I know this was a lot of information to take in. So if you still have questions, please send them. You'll see, let me put this slide up. You'll see the assessment at la.gov, which is kind of our clearinghouse for questions.
Yep, and as a reminder, this presentation and the recording will be posted to the website in the assessment guidance library, which is the same place you go for the assessment guides and all the assessment related resource materials. So it will, both will be housed there for all of the webinars that we've done, English, U.S. history, and the high school math.
So thank you, and keep the questions coming. Like I said, when you have time and this is posted, feel free, if you have questions about things I didn't cover, that you send us guidance. And then if you still have questions, of course, send them to us at Assessment At. Thank you. Have a good evening.
This has been a presentation of the Louisiana Department of Education, copyright 2017, all rights reserved. For more information or to contact the Louisiana Department of Education on the web, go to www.louisianabelieves.com or call 1-877-453-2721.